Hi everyone! For today's video, I'm going to be talking briefly about the painting process behind this little painting. Originally, this was going to be a real-time painting demonstration, and about a couple hours in, I realized that basically no one was going to want to sit through the whole 3 hours of it. So I thought instead of asking you to endure 3 hours, I'd give you maybe some of the highlights of my process and generally how I paint with acrylics. To begin with, I staged and printed a reference photo to use for the project. I like reference photos because the perspective and lighting conditions are fixed, but the trade-off is that sometimes the colors aren't always true to life. Once I had a reference photo, I gathered my supplies. For my painting surface, I chose a 5x7 hardboard panel that I underpainted in a thin glaze of yellow oxide. I knew I wanted to frame this painting to hang on my wall, but I didn't want to pay for a custom frame. The nice thing about hardboard is that it's pretty thin, and you can fit it into a typical off-the-shelf frame easier than a stretched canvas. The main reason why I use underpaintings is so that I can gauge the values more accurately, and white canvas can deceive the eye. I chose a yellow underpainting specifically because I wanted a warm, sunny feeling to the painting, and even if I do several layers, parts of the underpainting can still peek through. Next, I sketched out the basic arrangement of the painting with a white pastel pencil. I don't want too many lines, just enough to keep me in line with the perspective. Whenever I work on a tabletop versus an easel, I find that I sometimes distort the perspective, so the lines just help me keep everything in check. For paints, I am using Heavy Body Acrylic paints by Liquitex and Goldenedge. I really like both of these brands, and I often mix the two brands within a single painting. It always works really great. I'm setting out a pretty broad palette of colors for this painting. The colors I'm using are naphthol red, cadmium red, cadmium-free orange, cadmium-free yellow, yellow oxide, cerulean blue, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, burnt sienna, and a generous amount of titanium white. I decided to paint the negative space around the teacup first. The cast shadow under the teacup is painted in a bluish gray that I mixed from titanium white, burnt umber, and ultramarine blue. This is a glass table near a window, and it's picking up a lot of blues reflected from the sky. As I move towards the light away from the shadow, I'm mixing in a little cerulean to indicate the reflected sky. And, of course, more white. At this stage, everything is quite thin and watery, and you can still clearly see the yellow underpainting. I like to work in layers, and eventually I will work up to thicker, more opaque layers. Next, I blocked in the mandarin. The shadow side is mixed with cadmium-free orange and burnt sienna. The mid-tones are blocked in with cadmium red and orange. And for the very brightest point, I mix in a touch of cadmium-free yellow. I'll refine this more later on. In the meantime, I begin blocking in the teacup. I mix some white into the gray I mixed previously. I block in the tea using a thin mix of yellow oxide and burnt sienna. I reserve a small disc of underpainting, where the lemon slice will be eventually placed. A touch of white and cerulean indicate the reflected sky on the tea surface. At this point, the background is dry, so I re-emphasize some of the colors. I also increased the saturation of the blue areas with more cerulean, which I think will also complement the orange and yellow tones nicely. Some of the darkest parts of the painting are in the spoon here, and I block that in using a dark color mix from ultramarine blue and burnt umber. I add white for the bright reflected areas. All of the major areas are blocked out, so I begin refining the painting and building opacity with the different layers. The nice thing about layering in acrylics is that the whole process is accelerated, as compared to, say, oil paints. I treat the layering process as a way to build up colors from dark to light, and I also revise the composition to correct errors in shape, color, value, and perspective. In this painting, I think I did probably over 7 layers on the teacup. And a lot of that was just correcting and refining the value relationships in this painting. This particular painting has a lot of very subtle gray tones, so it took a bit of finessing to get those relationships correct. The interesting thing about painting in layers, even if you're just using the layers to correct errors, is that you begin to get a really three-dimensional effect that a single layer painting doesn't always have. The reason this occurs is because of the transparency of the individual paint layers. Even fairly opaque colors like titanium white still have some transparency to them, especially if you extend them with water. The more layers you do in a painting, the more you reinforce the illusion of dimensionality, because you can still see through the individual layers. For the rind, I mixed a yellow with yellow oxide and cadmium-free yellow. The white portion of the lemon is mixed with a subtle creamy tint of white and yellow oxide. The curl of lemon peel on the saucer is painted in a similar fashion to the rind inside the cup, but I used a bit more cadmium-free yellow to make it brighter. At this point, I began blocking in some of the little zinnias on the table. In the reference, I have several different colors of flowers that came from my garden. So cream, orange, and pink. And I started painting those in their original colors, but I decided I didn't like the way that the cream and the pink flowers were looking. So I decided just to make all the flowers orange to reinforce the blue and orange color scheme. One of the parts I was most eager to paint was this bit of gold banding on the cup. It's a really small detail, but it adds so much sparkle and interest. I mixed the base tone of the gold banding with yellow ochre on the sunlit side, and burnt umber and yellow ochre on the shadow side. For the final sparkle, I added broken lines of yellow ochre and white. As I start approaching the final layers, you'll notice the highlight becomes brighter and more pronounced. And I add the last few touches of bright color, like these little bright dots of yellow in the disc of the flower, to indicate the tiny little florets. I debated about painting the original pattern on the teacup or making one up. But I decided to simplify the composition instead, and I think it looks just fine without the pattern. If I want, I can always go back in later and add those details. After that, it was all ready to pop into a frame and put on the wall. I had this cheap little gold frame which I thought would really bring out the gold banding on the cup. And here's the completed painting. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please be sure to leave me a comment or even a thumbs up. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!